Greetings, this is the video recording of the research paper analysis task. I was given the objective to analyze the paper authored by Joshua and Francisco on muscle synergies heavily influence the neural control of arm endpoint stiffness and energy consumption. Before proceeding with the analysis, it is very important to understand the three key terms that are there in the title of this paper. Muscle synergies. Muscle synergies refers to a concept of the central nervous system in which it organizes muscle activation patterns in groups to simplify the control movement. Endpoint stiffness. Endpoint stiffness can be referred as the mechanical resistance of a limb against displacement at its endpoint. And in the paper, energy consumption is defined as the metabolic cost associated with activation of muscles. The problem statement that the paper is trying to address is on the conflicting finding of several research papers in the past about the central nervous system's ability to control limb impedance and energy consumption. It also explores the role of muscle synergies in this process. If one had to hypothesize, the hypothesis that the paper is trying to present is that muscle synergies significantly constrain the central nervous system's capacity to modulate arm endpoint stiffness and energy efficiency. So, the present conflict among the research community is spread in two different parts. One is on the regulation of arm stiffness. There are certain studies that claim that CNS can regulate the orientation and the eccentricity of the arm stiffness ellipses or the ellipsoid in 3D to perform a task efficiently during training. Another segment suggests that there is limitation in the stiffness modulation. It says that the CNS cannot arbitrarily regulate endpoint stiffness. This research paper is trying to reconcile this divergent findings that has been there in the past research. So, what is the relevance and significance of this work? One is definitely to actually come to a conclusion on the conflicting views that the past research papers have produced. Second is to understand muscle synergies in a more better way, to understand control stiffness and energy consumption and how muscle synergies affect it. Third, it has significant ability to produce results for rehabilitation. So, people with motor impairments, this research would enable researchers and doctors to understand better ways to rehabilitate those patients with motor impairments. The fourth is better design for robotics and prosthetics. So this study can uh, contribute more towards prosthetic design and how muscle stiffness can be incorporated and how how the CNS controls the overall muscle activation pattern. Now let us come to the methodology adopted by the paper in proving its hypothesis. The paper goes towards a computational approach to prove its hypothesis. It first defines a simple two-link model, planar model, with six muscles. You can see the model that it adopts has both articular, monoarticular, and biarticular muscles. Then it defines something known as the activation levels and the maximum force capabilities in activating those muscles, both as active components and passive components, and also incorporates tendon stiffness. Third, it uses mathematical formulations to calculate the endpoint stiffness and also to show the eccentricity plot for the endpoint stiffness. Then it again uses the metabolic cost function to get the energy consumption by each activations of these muscles, and then it actually simulates the synergies and sees that how the control of the endpoint stiffness decreases when muscle synergies exist, and how it again constrains the energy activations of the muscles. So now let us see what are the key findings that the research suggests. One is that there is reduced control over stiffness. The presence of muscle synergies significantly decreases the central nervous system's ability to vary the properties of endpoint stiffness. This is basically viewed by plotting the eccentricity plot. The eccentricity plot is basically plots the arm stiffness, which shows the directional dependence of arm's resistance to external forces. It is the shape of the stiffness ellipse in 2D and the ellipsoid in 3D, which shows how stiff the arm is. Now, it also, on the part of energy minimization, it states that muscle synergies restrict the ability of the CNS to minimize the energy consumption during movement. Thirdly, it states the finding on posture sensitivity. It states that the stiffness ellipse is highly sensitive to arms posture. So, the orientation and shape of the endpoint stiffness ellipse affects the range of movement that and the stiffness that it can produce at the endpoint. Lastly, it talks about the generalizability of these results, that the mechanical behaviors that the limb can achieve through it is basically a trade-off. The simplification of the control problem at the same point of time leads to the loss of control of the CNS and in decrease in the activation energy. These are some of the figures from the research paper. This is from the section where the authors are actually formulating their analysis and the computational approach they are adopting. Here you can see a simplified version of their 2-hour model where only one link is shown and 3 muscles are shown. Here J is basically the J is basically the Jacobian matrix, which translates the joint torque to endpoint forces. Here you can see R is the momentum matrix and K is the desired endpoint stiffness. M is the maximum force that the muscles can achieve. You can see it is a diagonal matrix and we have 3 muscles, so it's a 3 cross 3 matrix. Then we have the activation energy vector, which is denoted as A1, A2 and A3. Further, we come to section B, where the geometrical interpretations of the computational approach is plotted and described. Here you can see this is called the activation cube, where each edge of the cube represents the activation energy vector. Here you can see that there is this blue plane. This blue plane is basically the stiffness constraint. This plane represents the set of muscles, the activations that can achieve the desired endpoint stiffness, that is the Kn desired. Again, here you can see the green plane. The green plane is basically the zero endpoint force constraint. This ensures that the combination of the muscle forces results in zero net force at the endpoint, because the authors are actually doing this analysis in a static equilibrium position. That's the reason we are tending to obtain a zero net force at the endpoint. Here you can see this black line. This black line is the intersection of the stiffness and the zero endpoint force constraint. That is the blue plane and the green plane. This line represents the set of all muscle activation levels that can satisfy both the desired stiffness and equilibrium condition. Now, these are the isothermal manifolds of the uh, activation cube. Here you can see that the manifolds represents levels of energy consumption for different muscle activation combinations. So for a certain combination, you can see the different spherical shapes that are obtained in the activation cube. Now coming to the C section, where the authors plot the synergies present part. Here you can see again the activation cube is plotted. The magenta plane represents the additional constraint imposed by the presence of muscle synergy. Here, the activation cube is reduced by dimension, and here you can see that the constraint that is imposed is A1 equals to 2A2, which meaning the activation level of muscle 1 is twice that of muscle 2. There is a linear relationship reduces the dimensionality of the activation space because it binds both the muscles activations together. So here the mathematical formulation and the way the authors approach towards giving the conclusions and proving the hypothesis is described. In the result section, the authors describe some of these graphs. Uh, these graphs are the synergy groupings. They show how different muscle types in the arm and illustrate the cases of varying synergy weightings. Here you can see the weights of shoulder synergies were 1, 0.5, 0.5. Some of these plots are the carry-on plots from the previous research being carried by Osu and Kamen. And the author also adds more 3 plots from case 4 to case 5. These plots basically signify the ratios. The color-coded graphs signify the ratios of the stiffness of the activation energy of the elbow to the shoulder, and the scale shows how the ratio changes across different synergy weightings. It was also observed that most of the synergies are in places like the previous studies by Osu showed that the synergies were separate for monoarticular muscles, but in this cases the synergies were also taken for monoarticular muscles with biarticular muscles, and it shows a comprehensive study, and it also does the energy analysis further, which previous studies didn't actually do. Now you can see these plots show us the contributions of the muscle groups and how they can alter the joint's mechanical response, which has final implications for understanding the motor control strategies, which can be very desirable for rehabilitation using robotic systems that mimic basically human movement. Here, these are some of the plots where finally the author shows that how the present work carries on the research that the past was carried out by several authors, several researchers, so namely Osu and Komi and Hogan, where their study mostly focused on the size control of the ellipsoid, the shape control, and the orientation control, and how this study focuses on all 3 of them, enhances those studies, and also includes energy control. Here you can see the plot about the eccentricity and endpoint stiffness. This basically shows this basically shows that the desired endpoint stiffness ellipse becomes more eccentric as the number of achievable condition decreases, as indicated by the black regions where the eccentricity is almost equal to 1. Here you can see that the condition number is not achievable. That's the black region representing. Here you can also see the maximum potential possible energy reduction. On higher eccentricities, you can see comparatively more green bands. These green bands show that there's a maximum possible energy reduction if the eccentricity is more. So now let us come to some of the improvements that this research could further include, or how the further research can carry on in this field. One is on the nature that there was a very simplified version that was a planar case. They can be further studied in dynamic and three-dimensional models. One of the biggest shortcomings of this research is that it adopts a linear mechanism. The previous research has also carried on linear mechanism, but it is very evident that the muscle mechanics is not linear and it is non-linear. Hence, further research is required in that field. There's also the how more research opportunities towards the part how synergies can evolve from not just in static equilibrium conditions but also in dynamic conditions, and how our CNS optimizes movement, control, and energy and efficiency over a period of time. Further, uh, the passive and reflexive contributions haven't been studied in this research. There can be further research in this area where passive and reflexive contributions are also studied and how they contribute to the modulation of the CNS on muscle synergies could give us better perspective. One of the key findings, key problems with the present research is that it's a computational approach. There, the research quotes some of the methods in the past where they had shown some EMG validation. So it is great if there could be also a part where there was not only a computational validation but also an empirical validation using techniques like EMG, where the data could be recorded for different stiffness and different synergies that have already been proven to exist in the literature. So in class, we study how muscle synergies basically simplify how the CNS can activate muscles. For example, in a human being, there are several muscles, and during a very small movement, a lot of muscles are also involved. In that case, it becomes really, uh, in terms like computationally, very difficult for the CNS to process the entire movement. In class, we studied the existence of muscle synergies, where this entire control structure simplifies towards a greater extent, where the CNS is basically directly giving uh, command to those nodes. Those nodes are then represent the synergies, and those muscles responsible for a certain action get activated accordingly. But this study actually shows that uh, even though if it like simplifies the control problem, it is at the cost that the modulation of the endpoint stiffness reduces, and it also minimizes the energy consumption. Here, this research paper has carried on the work that has been in the past significantly better than the past research work, and also has come to a certain level of confirmation about the existence of synergies and also how they affect the control of endpoint stiffness and energy consumption. But there is a need to further validate this research with more empirical data and more realistic models, and also move from the assumption of linear muscle models to nonlinear muscle models, and also to take into consideration the three-dimensional movements. The link to the paper is given here. All the plots that were presented in this presentation were from the research paper, directly from the research paper, and that was for the analysis of this research paper. Thank you.